Okay, welcome to Coach Afia Law. Did I pronounce that correctly?
You did indeed, you did.
Thank you. Thank you, Afia. We want to talk about sevens football, which is completely new to me. So defensive football, and I just wanted to start off with I'm used to 11 man with the different formations, 4-3, 4-4, and things like that. What do you do in sevens?
Yeah, so there's a couple of options in sevens. I suppose they're all kind of scaled down versions of what we play in 11s. There's a little bit less that you can do in terms of the amount of players on the field. But I suppose, there's a few different things we can see. So some of it's, based on, offensive formation and how we'll line up based on offensive formation and our game plan. And some of it, might be more, by team and personal of that team and what the strengths are of that team and how they decide to play. But I think to highlight, a couple of key formations that we see in sevens to give you an idea. So first of all, we'll see a lot like a two front with two D linemen in there. And we see this, primarily, I would say, in a bit more in the passing game, if we're expecting a lot of passing, or, more in our situational, third and long, fourth and long. And we want, a few more players back in coverage, then we might move, a D lineman and leave two in there and bring someone back into coverage. So, with that, we generally see our two linemen heads up on the guards. And then, if we're seeing more of a spread offense, maybe we've got twins one side and a wide receiver out the other side. Then we'd have our corners out over our wide receivers, our free safety or our outside linebackers, on that slot receiver, and then that one middle linebacker in the middle who's playing more of a QB spy type role, and then obviously our strong safety back as well, helping to defend the pass. So we do see that again. It is on team personnel as well. Some teams, they might not have depth at line at the D line, so they might play more regularly with those two defensive linemen. But again, when looking at kind of scheme and game planning, we would tend to see that a little bit more in situational third and long, fourth and long, and when we're seeing a little bit more of a passing game. Saying that, we do have quite like a heavy run game in women's American football. We see a lot more of the run than of the pass. So I would say primarily across the board, we see more of a three front in seven-a-side football. So either with our three linemen heads up on the center and heads up on the two guards, or in kind of a condensed over or under front. So we have, our two ends coming off of the edge. And then we have our nose tackle that we can either, move in accordance to our game plan. So it might be lined up towards or away from the running back, or that we just, put them in an over or under and want them to line up according to the play call. So, we're also, quite a few teams have got quite good O-lines as well. So I think that's probably why we tend to see more kind of three fronts in seven-a-side football. If you've got a dominant O-line, you need to put more people on the line to make sure you can control that line and then, make sure you're in a good position as a defense. One thing that's quite interesting actually with when we have kind of a three front and we have a more heavy running game, maybe we've got a couple of tight ends in, running backs or wing backs, and we've got that heavy run game. It actually changes the roles of our DBs quite a lot. So our corners actually kind of almost play as outside linebackers. So because our field's condensed and we don't have those wide receivers out there, or sometimes we might have one wide receiver, but primarily the field becomes a lot more condensed. Our corners come in and they almost play that outside linebacker position, whereas they're playing force and they're setting the edge. So they still have that pass responsibility in terms of, if the tight end or whichever player releases, they've still got that pass responsibility, but they're actually playing run first and setting the edge there. So our corners play a really interesting role. And I suppose that's why your question is really interesting, right? Because we could call them corners or we could call them linebackers, depending on what we're seeing from the offense. So yeah, they play a really interesting role there in terms of playing the outside linebacker position as well as that corner position, depending on what we see. And then obviously our safety position, depending on team to team and what we see. If it's a heavy run game, sometimes teams decide to bring that safety down as more of like a strong safety player or as another linebacker, because they don't perhaps need the same support over the top. So sometimes we see that happening quite a lot in the 7-a-side league as well. And then, even if it's not heavy run games, sometimes we see that happening in terms of, rather than having that safety, we trust our corners to lock up on the receivers and we bring the free safety down to kind of be that other linebacker and help out. And that really helps that flow, because sometimes in 7-a-side football, it almost feels like there's a linebacker missing because of the numbers. So we actually almost bring another linebacker in by removing our safety, and they become that kind of outside linebacker or second kind of middle linebacker position. So yeah, that's kind of a little bit of our 3-front and how our players can move around in our 3-front. And then I think also it's just worth mentioning another formation we see quite a lot is, our 4-front. And I think that's quite similar to 11s probably in terms of like a condensed bare front. That we might use like more in short yardage situation or in goal line, whereas we can either, depending on personnel, we can bring an extra defensive lineman on and take a player off, or we can use that Mike or one of the other backers to, move up and sit in the A gap and play like that 4-man line instead. So those are kind of the fronts that I think we see a lot. And the formations that we see a lot and how we use the players in 7-a-side football. There are like so many variations on that I've seen, but I thought, those are probably 3 of the key ones that I've seen across particularly our league that we play in at the Lions. So I guess it's kind of interesting for me as well, like for yourself as an 11-a-side coach, if you were to reduce your defense to 7s, like how would you see that working for you? Because obviously a lot of the women's league, we've come into the sport learning 5s, 7s, sometimes 11s and 9s as well. So it's almost normal straight away. But I suppose it's a completely different perspective for yourself and other coaches that have coached in the uni or men's leagues to actually have to reduce that defense. So I guess like what would you try and do with your defense if you were to reduce it?
It's difficult, isn't it? It's like making my head spin already. I don't want to learn another one, but yeah. So is there any restrictions by rule? So you can't have a certain amount of pass rushers or anything, or is it just anything goes?
No, not as 7s. No, there's no restrictions.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it would be the same. Yeah, you bring that sort of 11-side philosophy and just think either I'm gonna stack up the line of scrimmage and make sure that we get pressure and give the DBs a harder job but less time to do it in, or not so much pressure or creative pressure, and then have some more secondary that are going to have more time for the pressure to get there. So, and then the run game. I mean, the run fits. I'd have to get a pen and paper and write the run fits down because it's hard to imagine it. But so, and width is it half the width? How wide is a 7?
Yeah,
field?
it's much smaller. So it's 35, I believe.
Oh, okay.
So it's a much more condensed field. So it
Right.
makes it, I suppose, a lot easier, although you've got less players. So then, it.
Yeah, I mean, we're 53 and a third, so 35. I'd say there's more space on your field than like with 7. Well, I'd have to do the maths again on with that. But does it feel like there's more space because you've coached some 11s, have you?
Yeah, so I've played quite a bit of 11s and coached 11s with Birmingham Bulls as well. So to me, I actually feel like there's more space. It feels like in 11-a-side, but actually, I suppose when you do the maths, it's slightly different. But then it also depends on what we're seeing from the offense. Because if we're seeing a more condensed offense in terms of that heavy run with more tight ends or wing backs or running backs, then if our outside linebackers or corners do their job well, then it feels very much like a very small field. If we get a player, an offensive player escape up the sideline and they need to be chased down, then it feels like a big field.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I kind of asked you a bit of a dated question as far as, yeah, what 3-4-4-3, because no one really uses that anymore. They just sort of adjust to formations, yeah, at 11s and clearly at 7s, yeah, whatever the formation is, and you have to adjust. And then you get those tweeners, like you say, your cornerbacks are tweeners between DBs and linebackers are, all right, so linebackers are tweeners.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And I think it all comes down to, who you're playing and game plan against that team, which I think it does at any level of football, right? That, every team you play is different, and every team that you play, you need to have a different game plan for, and you need to, potentially adjust fit for each game. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think it all comes down to that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why we love it, but it's the chess game, isn't it?
Exactly.
So, so as far as coverage is concerned, like so those corner when you see two tight ends, those corners that have got force and coverage, are they in a zone, a man, or both?
We do use both, so like across the league, or at least the part of the league that I've seen. Obviously, we're all in different divisions, but um, you know, teams do use both man and zone coverage. I think we would probably tend to see a little bit more of man coverage, either in that cover one with the one high safety, um, or sometimes like in a cover zero where we know it's a run and teams want to get rid of that safety and bring them down to play in the box and to be more of that linebacker position. Or if there's a blitz and safety needs to pick up, then we see that cover zero quite a bit then as well. We do see zone again. I think it's very situation again, but teams will probably play a bit more of zone coverage, situationally. If it's, third and long, fourth and long, something like that, then they're going to want more players in the deep part of the field and more likely to playing a zone coverage. But yeah, I think it does depend team to team, and it depends on, game planning, and it depends on the strength and personnel of that team and what they run well. Which, again, is probably something across all levels of the sport is the same.
Yeah, but so you've got a reduced field. Do you still talk about sort of cover two and cover three, like as far as the deep zones? Do you is that how you sort of term it?
Yeah, we do. So we still talk about it in the same way in terms of, the deep thirds, shallow zones or flats. And we still talk about the field and the responsibilities and, the fundamentals of coverages, I suppose, in exactly the same way. It just looks slightly different because you've got less players there
Yeah,
to move around and less players to sit in those zones.
right. Oh, that's interesting. I really like that. So, sort of the challenges sort of for individual players when they go from playing sevens a lot to 11s, and I guess at international level, like because the league is sevens, and then you go to internationally 11, so that must be a big challenge sometimes.
Yeah, I think it can be. I think it can be. It's, there's quite a big difference between sevens and 11s in the same way that, our youth leagues are still playing fives. That's a massive leap up to nines or sevens because
Yeah,
actually the game becomes a very different game. Like the general rules of the game still apply, but actually it's a completely different way of playing football. So I think, one of the key things that springs to mind when you ask that is special teams. We don't have any special teams. So, that makes a massive difference in terms of, for defense, in terms of defending extra points, because there's no kicking game. So we don't have to think about, defending a 1 point conversion. We don't have to think about defending field goals because they don't exist in seven aside. So actually, when you go to 11s, there's like an added complexity to defense that you have to understand how to defend that, and it is very different to what you would do in seven aside with the extra points in seven aside. So I think that's one of the things that makes a massive difference. I also think for defense, like field position is such a big thing, and because we don't have kickoffs and we don't have punts, field position doesn't exist in the same way. So it's hard, unless there's an interception, it's hard for the defense to kind of be in a bad field position from the first down.
right.
So in seven aside, when unless it's an interception, if the team doesn't get their first down or doesn't score on their second set of downs, then the ball goes back to the 5-yard line and the other team's offense receive the ball on the 5-yard line. So
Right.
field position isn't as much of a concern for the defense in 7-a-side unless there's an interception, which obviously makes, would change the field position. So I think that makes a big difference as well, because it's all football experience as well. And if you play defense at sevens for so long, it's a whole new situation you're put in as a player to then suddenly be in a really bad field position, and you've just got on the field and you haven't got a lot of space between where you are and your goal line. So it's a different level of experience as well that comes with that. So yeah.
Oh yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think as well, like there's so many little things and little changes that come with that. I think those are two key things that sprung to mind for me in terms of how it affects defenders. But I think as well, like you said, the size of the field makes a massive difference. The players on the field make a big difference. So as a linebacker myself, I had to go from reading a 3-man line to reading a 5-man offensive line. And again, like players that are newly coming through from 7-a-side football to 11-a-side, there's a whole complexity of learning, a more in-depth playbook. There's so much more you can do with 11 players on the field than 7 players. And actually, it is a big step up, I think, sometimes to learn an 11-a-side playbook, because there's so much more you can do in terms of, stunts, blitzes. We just talked about coverages, and actually, the same rules apply, but there's a lot more players that have to be in the right zones to make that an effective zone coverage. So I think all these little things really make a big difference in terms of that step up from 7s to 11s. However, I do think in terms of there's a lot of stuff that's the same. The game of football is the same in many ways, and I think fundamentals are the same. So I think a really key thing for not just 7s, but perhaps youth and 5-a-side as well, is fundamentals. Like the fundamentals of the game don't change. So, if in the 7-a-side women's league, if we're teaching, good tackling, if we're teaching good fundamental footwork, if we're teaching good football IQ, then that's all knowledge that players can use at that next level. So I think it's really key to ensure we're teaching those good fundamentals and putting players in that good position to succeed when they get to 11, so that yes, they do have to learn about special teams, and they do have to learn about a bigger field and more players on the field, and how does that change their responsibilities. But actually, they've got the fundamentals to go with that. They're already great footballers. They've already got good tackling fundamentals and good fundamentals for their position, and that will put them in a really good place to succeed when they get to 11s.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Yeah, even if you're playing 2 or 3 against each other, as long as you're playing good tackling, good blocking, you're going to be good. So when I wrote that question down, I was thinking you might say something like the defensive line, because when you've got 3 offensive line in front of you, they can't really come from many different angles. But when there's 5, you're going to be blocked from lots of different angles.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that comes with the complexity of learning that 11-a-side playbook, and actually understanding there's a lot more to think about in terms of where everyone needs to be, and where the offensive players are going to be in different formations, and what they're trying to achieve from those formations and those plays. So I think that comes with just the added complexity of understanding the next level and having those extra 4 players on the field, and how that makes a difference. But I think you're right. There's so much more going on in 11-a-side football than there is in 7-a-side football. So yeah, I think you're right. It does make a massive difference how many players are on the line, and especially from like a linebacker perspective or a safety perspective, you're seeing a lot more than what you are at 7s, and you need to be able to read the O-line or read the offense and what's happening, and that does take a completely different form in 7s to 11s. Potentially for some players it can be quite similar. I know we spoke about our corners being that outside linebacker position, but if we play a lot of spread teams at 7, then our corners maybe have a bit more of a similar job, that they're still going to be in man or zone coverage, and still could potentially be fairly similar there, unless we see a heavy run formation. So it probably does vary position to position as well. But I think, the biggest jump is that change in rules, that change in adding special teams in, and that change in the complexity of go from 7s to 11s.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. So, is there a skill that you've seen 7 players be much better at? So the thing I'm thinking of is they which we've kind of disproved now, but I'm thinking 7s players are really good tacklers because there's more space and not so many people. But is there a skill that you think those 7 players have really got that down and they're better than the 11s? It's all relative, but
yeah, it is. That's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, I think you're right. It's a smaller field, but there's less players. So I feel like, open field tackling, I've heard that come up quite a lot, that people have said, does it mean that, you've got a lot more players that are good at open field tackling and you're seeing a lot more of that? And I think, again, like it all depends so much on, the type of games that we're playing. If you're playing a team where, you're playing teams all season that are, a heavy run team, then you would like to think that if you play force and contain them, that actually all your tackles are made inside the box. It doesn't always work like that. You can hope that will happen, but doesn't always work quite like that. But I think it comes back to what we just said about fundamentals, that actually at all levels we're going to see some level of open field tackling at some point in the games. And if we can get fundamentals right in terms of correctly teaching tackling techniques, correctly teaching open field tackling drills, closing down space in drills and tackling and pursuit angles, then that's what we should be doing regardless of the level of the game, whether it's 5-a-side youth, whether it's 7-a-side women's, whether it's 11-a-side men's, university, national programs. These are such key skills for the contact version of the sport that actually everyone should be great open field tacklers, because we should all be doing all these fundamental tackling drills all the time and making sure that we're doing them well and we're doing them safely. So I think, again, it comes down to probably less about the level of the game that we're playing and the format of the game that we're playing, and more about, regardless of that, let's make sure we're drilling those key fundamental skills and key tackling drills that are going to be used across the board in football.
That's a perfect and very diplomatic answer. So, yeah, I mean, like you say, what you get, what you focus on, don't you? If you're going to practice good tackling, you're going to get good tackling. So.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're in such a key place in the sport at the moment in the country as well. Like, regardless of what level, there's always players coming in that are brand new to the sport. Whereas, in the States, you don't get that. You get kids coming through that have played since they've been able to walk, whether it's flag football or contact. They've been playing and they've developed those fundamental skills. And, over here, we have players coming in at different ages, of different experiences in sport, and which is fantastic. But then, it means that we're always needing to focus on those fundamental skills and, not just assuming that people are going to come in understanding them, because it is, a much smaller sport here, and people have much less experience of it.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, as a coach, I like that, because the growth of the player that's never played before is so much more visible and fast than a 10-year veteran that you might be able to just help a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely a steeper learning curve, isn't it? With new players coming in, there's so much to. I mean, I think when all of us first started football, we didn't really have a clue what was happening. I know when I first started football, it was just so brand new and I'd never seen it. And, it takes you a while to really absorb it. So that learning curve when you start, like you say, you can really develop a new player, and that's like fantastic to have players come in and just learn a new sport and really be able to develop and really be able to learn the sport and learn the game and develop in their position is brilliant to be able to have that.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So, is there any other challenges sort of moving from 7s to 11s, or vice versa, really, that you can think of?
No, I mean, I think the main challenge is, there's always going to be a challenge when people are playing two different formats of the game, and it's, a challenge that, parts of BAFA football face in terms of, youth football. Junior football is a little bit closer to the real version of the game with 9s, and women's football is 7. So I think it's, you know, a big challenge playing two versions of that. However, in some ways it's, you know, potentially useful for growing the game, you know, having those smaller scale games where more teams can enter because there's not the requirement to have such a large squad size. So it's really useful in some ways in terms of growing the sport, but actually for players that need to play or coach both, it's a lot more information to absorb and completely different mindsets to think about. Like when I coach with Birmingham Bulls, where I linebacker coach, we play, you know, normal 11-a-side football. I have a completely different kind of way of thinking about the game than when I'm playing or coaching 7-a-side, because it's so different. So yeah, there is that extra complexity, but at the same time, it can be really useful in terms of growing the sport as we're working towards, you know, full 11-a-side football in the women's game.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. It's just like, when I learned to play, there was 4 or 5 of our mates that would go down and play against each other, and depending on how many turned up, we would play that many aside. And it's
Yeah,
you're just learning to play the game. Yeah, you can figure out all the complexities later.
yeah, definitely, for sure.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much for the introduction to sevens and the challenges. I really appreciate it.
And thanks for having me. It's been nice to talk about it and hear a little bit about kind of your thoughts on sevens as well. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you.